In the Good Rain, Across Time and Terrain in the Pacific Northwest, author Timothy Egan stated that the Pacific Northwest is simply wherever the salmon can get to, and that rivers without salmon have lost the life source of the area. By that definition, the Pacific Northwest now resembles very little of its former self, and perhaps no watershed has lost the life source of the area more than the Columbia River Basin. All rivers have a story to tell, and the Columbia River once told a story of bounty and abundance. For thousands of years prior to Robert Gray's entry into the Columbia River estuary in the late 18th century, and for years after Lewis and Clark descended down the Columbia River during their expedition to the Pacific coast, anadromous fish swam freely and in unimaginable abundance. But as European settlers colonized the Pacific Northwest throughout the 19th century and human population growth accelerated, the Columbia River began to tell a story of progress, consumption, and manipulation at the expense of the natural environment. These activities continued to impact salmon and their habitats in profound ways, and anadromous salmonids now return to the Columbia River Basin at a fraction of their historical abundance. As salmonid populations remain vulnerable to extinction in many areas of the Columbia River Basin, efforts are being undertaken to restore depressed populations throughout their historic range. One such program is Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife's Chum Salmon Reintroduction project, aimed at restoring once historically abundant chum salmon populations throughout their native range on the Oregon side of the Columbia River Basin. Although the ultimate goal of this project is recovery, it is crucial to have an understanding of historical abundance and the limiting factors affecting current abundance and distribution before successful efforts can be undertaken. To that end, let's take a closer look at the history of salmonids in the Columbia River Basin. The Columbia River was one of the most productive salmon rivers in the world, with an abundance of Pacific salmon and steelhead historically returning annually to spawn in the basin's mainstem and tributary reaches. Chapman estimated these pre-development returns at 7.5 to 8.9 million fish annually, based on commercial catches around the year 1900. And the Northwest Power and Conservation Council indicated these returns may have ranged from 10 to 16 million fish annually, based on cannery records and Native American accounts. Annual returns in recent times represent a fraction of these historical estimates, rarely exceeding 2 million fish per year. Declines in abundance of Pacific salmon in the Columbia River can be seen across all species and populations. Examples include summer-run Chinook destined for the upper Columbia River that commonly reached weights over 80 pounds, sockeye salmon that migrate to upper tributary lake habitats in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia, coho salmon occupying lower Columbia watersheds, steelhead that were once widely distributed throughout the Columbia River Basin, and chum salmon, the most abundant anadromous salmonid in the lower Columbia River Basin historically. Robust salmon returns provided an abundant food source for the native peoples of the Columbia River Basin. For centuries prior to European settlement, Native Americans caught salmon for their own use and also as a trade good for supplies exchanged with inland Native American tribes. Commercial fishing by European settlers began in the 1820s, but remained limited due to the absence of long-term storage technologies until canning revolutionized the industry in the 1860s. By 1883, the number of canneries peaked at 39, and concerns of overfishing were evident. Spring and summer Chinook stocks were considered severely depressed by 1889, and packers began to extend their operations later in the year to harvest sockeye and steelhead to increase fish supply. Several years later, chum and coho salmon were also being harvested to keep canneries operational, despite being considered inferior table fare. At about the same time as commercial harvest was depleting salmon stocks in the lower river, habitat degradation was occurring in all areas of the Columbia River Basin. Irrigation reduced water flows and trapped juvenile salmon in irrigation canals, streambed mining destroyed spawning sites, and further habitat loss occurred due to intensive land use activities such as logging and cattle grazing. Additional damaging practices included the operation of splash dams, the removal of large woody debris from streams and rivers, and diking, dredging, and filling activities in the lower estuary. Prior to construction of the first dams on Columbia River tributary reaches in the late 1800s, and then construction of large dams on the mainstem Columbia and Snake River systems beginning in the 1930s, anadromous salmonids were able to fully access historical habitats in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and British Columbia. This historical distribution included nearly 13,000 miles of streams and rivers below natural barriers in the Columbia River Basin. Dam construction beginning in the late 1800s exacerbated salmon declines already occurring from years of overfishing and habitat degradation, and a significant amount of historical habitats were permanently blocked after numerous dams were constructed without fish passage. Salmon and steelhead now return to the Columbia River Basin at a fraction of their historical abundance, with many fish now of hatchery origin due to the numerous hatchery rearing facilities in the basin. Currently, 13 stocks of Columbia River Basin salmon and steelhead are listed under the Endangered Species Act. Chum salmon have the broadest natural distribution of any Pacific salmonid species, named from Chinook jargon terminology describing the unique markings along the side of the body. Chum salmon range in Asia from Korea to the Arctic coast of Russia and west to the Laptev Sea, and in North America from Monterey, California to the Arctic coast and east to the Beaufort Sea. In the Columbia River, adult chum salmon typically weigh between 8 and 15 pounds and return to spawning tributaries from late October through early December cued by fall rain. After spawning, adults die, and eggs incubate in gravels for several months before hatching in spring. Chum fry quickly outmigrate from their natal streams to rear in the Columbia River estuary before entering the Pacific Ocean in May and June. Chum salmon adults spend 3 to 5 years in the ocean before migrating back to freshwater to repeat the life cycle. Beginning in the 1930s and extending into the 1940s, chum salmon experienced precipitous declines in abundance and distribution in the lower Columbia River. From historical returns of over 1 million adults and a spawning distribution encompassing virtually all tributaries downstream of Celilo Falls, currently only hundreds to thousands of chum salmon return to the lower Columbia River each year, representing a loss of 90% of historical populations. In response to these declines, Columbia River chum salmon was listed as threatened in 1999. This evolutionary significant unit, or ESU, comprises 3 major population groups, including coastal, cascade, and gorge populations. Within the major population groups are 17 historically distinct independent populations. In Oregon, these historical populations include Youngs Bay, Big Creek, Clatskanai River, Scappoose Creek, Sandy River, and Clackamas River. In Washington, these historical populations include Grays and Chinook Rivers, Alokoman River, Mill Creek, Cowlitz River Summer and Fall Run, Kalama River, Lewis River, Salmon Creek, and Washougal River. Shared populations for both states include Lower Gorge and Upper Gorge tributaries. Of the 17 historical populations, 15 are so depleted that their probability of persistence is very low or they are now extirpated. Moreover, the historical distribution up to Celilo Falls has been reduced to isolated populations below Bonneville Dam. Almost all natural production now occurs in only 2 populations, primarily on the Washington side of the Columbia River. Extending to river kilometer 230, these populations include the Lower Gorge, which in Washington comprises chum salmon returning to Hamilton Creek and an artificial spawning channel in Hamilton Springs in the town of North Bonneville, spawners in mainstem Columbia River side channels near Pierce and Ives Islands, fish returning to Hardy Creek on the Pierce National Wildlife Refuge, and chum salmon returning to another artificial spawning channel in Duncan Creek in the town of Skamania. And in Oregon, where productivity is lower and returns are less consistent, the Lower Gorge population includes chum salmon spawners in the mainstem Columbia River near Horsetail and Multnomah Creeks. The second population with significant natural production is in the Grays River, Washington, a stronghold in the ESU, where spawner abundance sometimes exceeds 10,000 fish annually. Natural spawning has also been observed to a lesser extent in the mainstem Columbia River upstream of the I-205 bridge associated with groundwater seeps in the Washougal population. Chum salmon typically spawn in the lower reaches of tributaries or in shallow water in the mainstem Columbia River, and their spawning activity can assist in important stream functions such as gravel cleaning and fine sediment transport. Additionally, various species are known to consume chum salmon throughout their life cycle. This includes a variety of bird and fish species which prey upon juveniles during outmigration from natal streams, and aquatic mammals which consume adults in the ocean or during the spawning migration. After spawning, chum salmon carcasses may be consumed by mammals, crayfish, and insects, and nutrients can often be found in riparian trees and streamside vegetation. Given the importance of chum salmon, it is a major priority of Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to rebuild historic chum salmon populations on the Oregon side of the lower Columbia River. Strong support for chum recovery by a diverse group of stakeholders led to development of the Lower Columbia River Conservation and Recovery Plan for chum salmon in 2010. Led by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in collaboration with state, federal, and local agencies, this planning process provides a strategic approach to chum salmon recovery based on science, stakeholder support, and considers limiting factors and critical uncertainties in future recovery actions. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife's Chum Salmon Reintroduction project was created out of this planning process. Funded through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund, the Chum Salmon Reintroduction project began in 2012, over a decade after Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife began a similar reintroduction project. The project started with an important agreement between the two states that allowed Oregon to acquire eyed chum salmon eggs from Washington. These eggs were produced by collecting both natural and hatchery chum from Grays River, Washington, and integrating the two stocks during spawning at Grays River Hatchery. This was a crucial first step for Oregon in its long road to recover Columbia River chum salmon, given Oregon returns were too small to start a local conservation hatchery broodstock. Big Creek Hatchery, located 3 miles upstream of Napa Slough, would allow eggs transferred from Washington and from adults returning to Big Creek Hatchery to be reared to the fed-fry stage before direct releases occurred into Big Creek. From 2011 through 2014, eggs transferred from Washington and reared at Oregon's Big Creek Hatchery allowed Oregon to achieve its initial goal of releasing 100,000 fed fry annually into Big Creek to jumpstart the reintroduction program. In 2015, another transfer of eggs from Washington, in addition to eggs collected from adults returning to Big Creek Hatchery, allowed Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to reach an increased release of approximately 200,000 fed fry. The Chum Project discontinued egg transfers from Washington after the 2015 release, with an expectation of relying solely on Big Creek returns for future efforts. This expectation was achieved in fall 2015, as a strong return of both hatchery and wild adults to Big Creek Hatchery led to another 200,000 fed fry release into Big Creek in 2016. A hatchery and genetic management plan currently allows the Chum Project to collect up to 600,000 eggs for production needs. This allows the project to rear approximately 300,000 chum fry at Big Creek Hatchery for release into Big Creek, and utilize additional adults for outplanting or egg or fry releases in lower Columbia River tributaries. The Chum Project was steadily inching closer towards the 300,000 fed fry release goal outlined in the Hatchery and Genetic Management Plan after the 2016 release. This goal requires 120 pairs of adults be collected at Big Creek Hatchery. In 2012, when Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife hired staff for the project, including former reintroduction coordinator Kristen Hummel, there was a need to implement the chum recovery strategy. This recovery strategy included identifying and addressing limiting factors, reestablishing self-sustaining naturally producing chum salmon populations, and monitoring the effectiveness of the strategy. Initial monitoring and recovery efforts began in the coastal stratum in the Clatskanie River and Scappoose Creek populations, as it was thought these watersheds had the greatest chance of successful reintroduction due to the absence of hatchery salmonid releases. These initial efforts, which included conducting chum salmon spawning surveys, juvenile fish monitoring, and habitat surveys, would show only the Clatskanie River watershed as still suitable for chum recovery efforts. The Scappoose Creek population was found to be severely degraded in the portions of the watershed where chum could spawn, so efforts were shifted to select locations within the Youngs Bay and Big Creek watersheds. The Clatskanie River population remains a priority, as high-quality spawning habitats still exist in the watershed and some juvenile chum salmon production has been observed in recent years. Additionally, the project has observed chum salmon spawners and documented fry production in the Lewis and Clark River and in multiple locations in the Big Creek watershed, so these are high priority areas for recovery efforts as well. In 2013, the first reintroduction efforts occurred on the project. In this year, marked chum salmon were outplanted into Graham and Stewart Creeks in the Claskenai River population, and unmarked chum salmon returning to Big Creek Hatchery were outplanted upstream. This work expanded during the strong return years in 2014 and 2015, as adults were outplanted again into Stewart Creek, and approximately 50,000 eggs each year were transferred into a remote site incubator in Perkins Creek, also in the Claskenai River population. Modest juvenile production was observed from adult outplants in Graham Creek and in Big Creek upstream of the hatchery, suggesting these areas may only be moderately beneficial for chum recovery efforts. However, significant juvenile production occurred in Stewart Creek, and a high survival of eggs was observed from fry reared in the remote site incubator in Perkins Creek. But then in 2016, a curious thing happened. Unexpectedly, an estimated 42,000 adult chum salmon returned to spawn in the lower Columbia River Basin in Washington and Oregon, the highest escapement observed in 50 years. Fish were observed on spawning surveys conducted by staff in the Lewis and Clark and South Fork Claskenine rivers, and in the Big Creek population, including in Big Creek downstream of the hatchery. However, few adult chum salmon returned to Big Creek Hatchery in that year, resulting in only 37,000 fry released in 2017. Returns to Big Creek Hatchery later that year would also be modest, but this time would coincide with a poor adult return throughout the entire lower Columbia River. Again, no outplanting efforts could be undertaken, as fry production came up short of the minimum release goal, and all fish were released into Big Creek to protect the local conservation hatchery broodstock. After 2 poor adult return years leading to minimal fry releases into Big Creek and no reintroductions, the Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project had to be proactive, so permission was again received from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to acquire 50,000 eggs to supplement future Big Creek hatchery releases. This was in exchange for continued assistance by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife with adult chum salmon collections in the Grays River. Supplementing Big Creek returns with Washington egg transfers provided a much-needed boost to chum fry releases in 2019 and 2020. However, adult returns to Big Creek Hatchery in those years were modest, and corresponding fry releases only allowed the chum project to exceed the minimum release goal with no reintroductions. Overall, poor returns required the chum project to forego reintroduction efforts for brood years 2016 through 2019, while focusing on protecting annual fry releases into Big Creek. Causes for the significant decline and lack of recovery of Columbia River chum salmon are pronounced and complex. For instance, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council estimated by the late 1800s that 57 fish wheels and 156 salmon traps were in operation on the Columbia River. And as other more prized salmon stocks collapsed from overfishing, newly directed harvest of chum salmon would exceed 70% of annual returns to the Columbia River. This led to a substantial decline of chum salmon that was further exacerbated by the degradation of the species' most crucial spawning and rearing habitats. More specifically, chum salmon spawn in the low-gradient downstream sections of Columbia River tributaries. These areas are prone to accumulate sediment from upstream land use activities such as logging, agriculture, and road construction. Eggs covered by increased sediment loads in altered and degraded systems can be suffocated and experience high mortality. In these altered systems, a high number of chum salmon spawners are necessary to adequately flush out increased sediment loads to provide clean gravels to support sufficient egg-to-fry survival. But most Columbia River chum salmon populations in Oregon are now depressed, leaving too few spawners to clean gravels. Similarly, estuarine habitats are crucial for rearing, as chum fry outmigrate rapidly from natal streams. Beach seining by the Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in 2013 found shallow water habitats around island complexes to be important during estuary residence time. However, estuary habitats in the lower Columbia River utilized by outmigrating chum fry have also been significantly altered due to diking, dredging, and filling activities, which have contributed to a loss of over 60% of vegetated tidal wetlands. The low number of chum fry outmigrants entering the estuary from currently depressed populations also makes fry more vulnerable to predation. Harvest is no longer considered a limiting factor, as commercial fishing for chum salmon was closed in the 1950s, and no targeted chum fisheries now exist in the Columbia River. However, the combination of historical overharvest and then habitat degradation as populations became depressed and have remained at low abundance, shows the complexity of recovering Columbia River chum salmon. Habitat surveys conducted by the Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project showed degraded habitat conditions exist for chum salmon in many areas of the coastal stratum, including the Scappoose Creek population. However, these same surveys revealed high-quality habitat which would benefit from restoration activities can still be found in other areas, including sections of the Lewis and Clark, Big Creek, and Clatskanie River watersheds. Restoration activities that improve and restore these high-potential areas will be crucial for successful recovery efforts. A significant step for long-term restoration efforts in the Youngs Bay and Big Creek populations recently began with the completion of the Return of the Red Strategic Action Plan. This collaboration between the North Coast Watershed Association and partners such as Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife seeks to improve chum salmon habitat in the Youngs Bay and Big Creek watersheds through collaboration with local property owners and other stakeholders. Short-term habitat restoration currently being explored by the Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project is to create artificial spawning channels. These channels are constructed to contain a suitable mixture of spawning gravels, depth, flow, and temperature to maximize egg-to-fry survival, which may exceed 50% in properly designed channels. The Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project recently conducted a 2-year study to explore the potential of installing an artificial spawning channel on Sundial Island near the mouth of the Sandy River. Although the study found conditions not suitable for a spawning channel, efforts are now underway to explore other sites, including the nearby Sandy River Delta. Long-term habitat restoration strategies will be used to improve and restore the natural habitat function of streams over time, and short-term strategies as a buffer to increase near-term spawner abundance. Ultimately, by combining these habitat strategies with conservation broodstock releases at Big Creek Hatchery and reintroduction efforts, including eggs reared in remote site incubators where we found survival rates to exceed 95%, we hope to improve the distribution and abundance of spawners in the recovery populations. Another potential limiting factor the Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project has investigated as a potential mortality source for juvenile chum salmon is Ceratonova shasta. Endemic to the Pacific Northwest, this microscopic parasite requires the presence of a polychaete worm to complete its life cycle and is known to cause necrosis and hemorrhaging of the intestines in salmon. From 2018 through 2020, water sampling was initiated throughout lower Columbia River tributaries to determine the spatial, temporal, and concentrations of Ceratonova shasta at selected sites. In 2019, lab and in-river studies were conducted in collaboration with Oregon State University to evaluate susceptibility of chum fry to infection. Ceratonova shasta was widespread in tributaries where chum salmon historically spawned but are no longer present, and where only intermittent spawning still occurs today, but was not found in contemporary streams during the time period when juveniles are present. Additionally, higher concentrations of Ceratonova shasta were observed at warmer water temperatures. In field studies, exposure of chum fry to low densities of Ceratonova shasta caused up to 100% mortality of fry, and lab studies showed a dose of 5 spores were lethal to fish. These findings have led to recent efforts to release hatchery chum fry earlier in the spring at Big Creek Hatchery when water temperatures are colder, and will likely guide the selection of future reintroduction sites. An additional study the Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project will be looking to initiate in the near future is an evaluation of predation impacts by other fishes on juvenile chum fry survival during outmigration. Outlined as a concern and critical uncertainty for chum recovery by diverse stakeholders in the Lower Columbia River Recovery Plan in 2010, the impacts of predation on juvenile chum fry survival are still largely unknown. Adult chum salmon returns to Big Creek Hatchery were inconsistent through 2019, which tempered fry release goals for Big Creek and halted reintroduction efforts in recent years. However, 2020 proved to be a bright spot for the Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project and Big Creek returns. Nearly 1,000 adults were captured at Big Creek Hatchery in 2020. This was the highest number of chum salmon captured at Big Creek Hatchery in at least 40 years, and was nearly 700 fish more than the previous high catch over that time period. For the first time, the Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project was able to meet its desired goal of releasing 300,000 fry into Big Creek and also conducting reintroduction efforts. After 4 consecutive years of no reintroductions, surplus adults were outplanted into Bear and Little Bear creeks in the Big Creek population to evaluate spawning potential. Reintroduction efforts occurred on 6 different days from November 17th through December 14th and included a total of 641 adults released into the 2 creeks. Although some fish were later recaptured at Big Creek Hatchery or observed outside of the Bear Creek watershed, spawning surveys in the 2 creeks showed many outplanted chum spawned in the watershed after release. Juvenile monitoring in Bear Creek during the spring of 2021 and future genetic analysis of caudal clips collected from chum fry will provide data to gauge the success of the reintroduction effort. Moving forward, the Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project will look to build off of a successful 2020. Hopes are high that the large number of 3-year-old adults observed from the 2020 return will also translate into a strong return of 4-year-old adults in 2021. This would allow the project to continue reintroduction efforts for the 2nd straight year and once again achieve Big Creek release goals in 2022. Consistently strong returns of chum salmon to Big Creek Hatchery that meet release goals and allow for reintroduction efforts will be crucial to the success of recovering Lower Columbia chum salmon. The Chum Salmon Reintroduction Project will continue to conduct spawning surveys to monitor for the distribution and abundance of adult spawners and operate juvenile traps to evaluate fry production from select Lower Columbia watersheds. These efforts remain essential for evaluating status and trends in natural ordinance spawners and determining success of reintroduction efforts. And most importantly, staff will continue to make efforts to determine and address limiting factors affecting the abundance and distribution of chum salmon in the Lower Columbia River. This includes identifying high-priority locations for habitat restoration to create or improve spawning habitat, improving Big Creek Hatchery fry release strategies that maximize fry to adult survival and minimize straying, identifying suitable remote site incubator and adult outplant locations in anticipation of future reintroduction efforts, and better understanding the impact of Serotonova shasta, predation, and estuarine processes on juvenile chum salmon survival during outmigration. The decline of chum salmon in the Columbia River has left a major void in the basin for nearly 100 years. At one time, chum salmon were the most abundant anadromous fish species in the Lower Columbia River, with returns in some years exceeding 1 million fish. Now, only hundreds to thousands of fish return each year, resulting in a substantial loss of marine-derived nutrients and the large spawning aggregations which cleaned and sorted gravels in lower tributary habitats. The nutrients supplied by the various life stages of chum salmon were important to a variety of bird, fish, and mammal species, and also beneficial to riparian trees and streamside vegetation. Humans too have been negatively impacted, and this is most obvious when factoring in the huge economic loss of harvest opportunities for meat or roe consumption. The economic significance of harvest opportunities can be seen in Alaska, where intact chum salmon populations, in addition to hatchery supplementation, support harvests valued at over $100 million each year. But I would argue of more importance to humans is simply the loss of an iconic species that once was and should still be a commonly occurring part of our landscape. With its unique purple and black vermiculations along the side of the body and large canine-like teeth, there is no other fish species like the chum salmon. Efforts to recover Columbia River chum salmon will continue to be challenging, and due to the altered landscape in the Lower Columbia River Basin, population recovery goals will need to be tempered from the historically high abundance of years past. But with continued research, monitoring, and recovery efforts by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and other partners, in addition to community and stakeholder involvement and support, we can rewrite the narrative of Columbia River chum salmon for the next 100 years. To learn more and receive updates about Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife's Chum Salmon Reintroduction project, follow along at odfwchum.forestry.oregonstate.edu. To learn how you can become involved and support efforts to guide future habitat improvements and restoration in Youngs Bay, Big Creek, and other areas, check out the Return of the Reds website at returnofthereds.com.